All right. So Melinda, my understanding is that you actually have a degree in molecular biology. So I would love to know, just to explain to everybody how you got from that degree to becoming a parenting expert and being an expert in, child development and the science behind that.
Yeah, so I did study molecular biology, and then I decided to become a science journalist. So I went and got a master's in science journalism from NYU, which is where I teach now. And the first like 10 years or so, this was back in 2006 when I graduated, I was covering a lot of molecular biology, a lot of genetics, a lot of neuroscience. And I still sometimes cover that. But then I had kids. So I have a 12-year-old and an almost 9-year-old now. And when I had my son, I was like, I had so many questions. And I could not figure out how to get good answers to them. I would go on Google and I would find that there were like 4 different conflicting answers to my questions. And so I wondered I wonder if science could help me answer my parenting questions. So I started digging around and I saw there was just like tons of research on all different aspects of child development. And I started writing a column for Slate, a parenting column, a science-based parenting column. And I feel like you would think that like I'd answered all the parenting questions in the universe at this point, but I feel like as my kids grow and as things change in the world, like I continue to have new questions and new issues to cover. So I ended up writing a book, and now I write my newsletter, and I'm just like, I love it. I love it because I feel like science gives us something to sort of anchor ourselves to. It doesn't have all the answers, but it can help sort of whittle away at like what is on average like the best approach or the best way to handle certain situations. And there's just so much research there to write about.
I somehow feel as a parent of now adult children, like they're never ending. I still have questions and they're adults. So like, I think parenting is the one thing you will never run out of questions on, no matter what. Things change, technology changes, issues change, and then some things remain the same. So we're glad to have experts like you on hand to answer these questions. So next question, love the title of your book. I just think it obviously is going to pop out on the shelf with most people. How did that come around? And was your publisher okay with that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the idea for the book came to me in the fall of 2018, which was, you might recall, Trump was president. We were in the middle of the Brett Kavanaugh hearings. We had just had an explosion of Me Too allegations. I was feeling pretty like devastated by the state of the world. I was like, I can't believe somebody accused of sexual assault is so readily welcome to the highest court of the country. And I realized at that point, like as a parent, that what I wanted more than anything else was to basically make sure that my kids did not grow up to be Donald Trump. And I was really worried because I know that kids learn based on what powerful people do around them. Like they learn what's okay and, what they are allowed to do. And so I was like, are they, hearing about what Trump is doing and hearing, all of the other kinds of rhetoric that he was inspiring that might be, happening in their school? Like, were my kids learning from that? And how do I push back against that? So I was actually out to dinner with my husband. It was our anniversary dinner. And I remember like sitting there, just kind of like, just in a mood. Right. And I had this plum cocktail and I took a sip, and out of the blue, I just said, I should write a book called How to Raise Kids Who Aren't Assholes. It was like, I looked at my husband and he was like, oh my God, yes, like that's your book. And I was like, oh my God, I think this is my book. Cause I'd been wanting to write a book, but I didn't know what. So then, I pitched it to my agent first, and then went to my now publisher. And we definitely had some conversations about whether it would affect sales. Like I knew I wouldn't be able to get on morning shows. Like Good Morning America is not going to have an author of a book with a swear word in the title. Like, would it affect, how the book could be marketed and sold? But at the same time, we were like, it really just captures this sentiment that I think a lot of parents were having. It was like, how do we raise kids who aren't assholes in this like world full of assholes?
Just out of curiosity, have you got pushback? Have you had like people, I'm just curious, like what the reaction was to some of that. I'm sure you have. So I'm just, if there was any good stories on that.
I haven't had as much as I have thought. There was definitely like an older woman in my community. They did a write-up in my local paper, and she wrote me like this very mean email about how inappropriate it was to use the word asshole in a title and to refer to children as assholes, which I really feel like I wasn't doing. I'm not really calling kids assholes in
Right.
the title. It's more like how to raise kids who won't grow up to be assholes,
Right.
anyway. And yeah, and then, there've been reviews on Amazon that are like, oh, she says to talk to kids about race and sexism, and so she's a terrible liberal, and like I get a lot of that. But
Right. I'm sure you.
yeah, so it's basically like old ladies who don't like swear words, and then right-wing people who don't like what my messages are.
Well, I'm going to guess that a lot of people like it. I think it's funny and eye-catching. So let's dive into the science though of all of this. And I think the one thing I want to start with is that one of the things that we hear so much today, whether it's in schools or whether it's in policies that are being pushed, is that we have to protect our kids. We have to protect them from these hard topics. So things like we don't want to talk or teach about race or sexism or anything of that nature. Can you tell us what the science actually says about that?
So this was a theme that I encountered over and over again as I was working on my book and talking to different experts, like in all different fields. And basically everyone said, first of all, the instinct to protect our kids from like tough topics is so common, and it is obviously very well intentioned, but it is extremely counterproductive. It often backfires. And that's because it's based on an incorrect assumption, which is that if we don't talk about these things with our kids, then they won't learn about it at all. Like they won't hear about it or be exposed to it. And that's not what happens. We know that, kids are hearing about very big, difficult, gnarly issues from their friends, from the media, from the internet, from, things they're overhearing at school. So when we don't talk about these things with our kids, we aren't ensuring that they don't hear about it. We're just ensuring that they don't hear about it from us. And likely the things they are hearing about it are, inaccurate or maybe don't align with our values. And I also learned that there are developmentally appropriate ways to talk about pretty much anything with kids once they're in like preschool age and early elementary school. So, you're not going to get into maybe all of the things that you would if you were talking to an adult friend, but there are ways to talk about, gun violence and race and racism and sexism and gender identity and all these things. And we know that they benefit kids. Like we know that kids whose parents have talked to them about like sex, for instance, are less likely to take sexual risks and, less likely to get pregnant as teenagers. And we know that kids whose parents talk to them about race and racism are much less likely to act in racist ways than other kids. In fact, there was a study that just came out that kind of confirmed that we should be talking to our kids about these issues, even though it's really hard.
So I guess as a parenting expert, like how do you approach these topics with your kids? Because I know people who are like, say, kids, well, I think there's one of the things, a lot of parents are like, we need to protect them. We can't, like you just said, we can't share this, but they know. I grew up in an age where we didn't have social media. So there probably was a lot of things that I was really naive about, but I still noticed things like, race or sex or how girls were treated or how girls' sports were diminished compared to boys. But you just notice these things as a kid. So is there a way like to think through as whether a child brings it up to you or because you just know they're being exposed to it, like how do you approach those conversations?
Yeah, it is really hard. And because we have been socialized to not talk about so many of these things, like it makes us very uncomfortable, and especially talking to kids about it. One thing that, really works across the board is to go in with questions, open-ended questions to your kids. Like, hey, I was wondering, have you heard anything about racism? Or have you heard anything about what happened on the news today with Trump? Have you heard anything, and just sort of like feel out whether they have actually been exposed to some of this stuff. And then, ask, well, so what have you heard? Let's talk about it a little bit. Another thing I do with issues that I really want to find ways to talk to them about, but that aren't like, they don't seem like things that would just come up naturally. I'm like constantly looking around in my environment to see if there are things that can spark conversations. So like for instance, if, when we would drive around and I would drive my kids to extracurriculars, if I saw a Black Lives Matter sign on somebody's yard, I would say, oh, hey guys, do you see this Black Lives Matter sign? Do you remember what that means? Like, or do you know what that means? They often forget things. And then we would, have a conversation. Or if we are watching a TV show and somebody does something that's like kind of sexist or, something that raises an issue in the world, then I will kind of pause it and say, hey, did you notice that? Like, I remember once when the Olympics were on, I think, was that last summer? I don't remember. Maybe it was 2 years ago. What is time?
Yeah.
There were the women kayakers, and the announcer kept referring to the male kayakers as men and the women kayakers as girls. And I was like, oh my goodness. And I paused it and I was like, did you all notice that he referred to, the women as girls there? What do you think that's about? Like, why do you think that happens? Why is he saying it that way? And what does it say about women? So just like trying to be tuned into opportunities to have conversations about these topics can be really helpful.
I heard you say I think it was on a podcast, and I really loved this, that kids are little detectives, that they start to notice and find things at a pretty early age. Like, how young do kids start noticing kind of like societal stereotypes or differences in people, or, anything that is a topic that probably parents need to start addressing?
Yeah, very young. So yeah, really, like, if you think about it, one of the most important jobs for kids is to figure out what matters in this world, right? We are social creatures, and they start from a very young age trying to figure out, like, what are the social categories that matter? What are the social, graces that matter? Like, they are really trying to pay attention to what's going on around them. And we know, like, for instance, talking about race, we know that babies as young as 3 months old do see skin color differences, and they actually start to show preferences toward people who share the same skin color as their caregivers. So we know that these are things that kids notice very early. And once kids are toddlers, really, they also start to notice if there are any like differences in power hierarchies between things that they see and notice as these social categories. So they will very early on see, wow, like, most of our US presidents have been white, and all of them have been men. And they really, and this is like the most powerful job in the country. And they think, what's that about? I wonder why that is. And if we don't, pause and say to them, hey, do you know why most, all but one US president has been white? They might, and they often do, try to make inferences themselves. And they'll think, well, gosh, maybe white people are just smarter. Maybe white people are just more powerful. And they do the same with gender. They say, gosh, most of the men who have really powerful jobs, or most of the people who have powerful jobs in this country, not all of them, it's changing, but a lot of them are men. And does that mean women maybe aren't as capable and aren't as smart? And we see this in the research too, like kids saying these heartbreaking things like, maybe women just can't be president, like they would not do a good job. So yeah, kids are noticing things. Even if they're not like overhearing things, they are seeing things as well. And they are making judgments based on what they're seeing. So we have to get in there and kind of interrupt the inferences they might be making.
I heard you talk too about the approach. So in terms of how you approach some of these conversations, say there may be a difference between how you talk about race versus how you talk about like sexism. Can you kind of explain, just for parents, because those are two topics that are definitely going to come up in our society. Why is there a different approach, or, why might there be a different approach in how you discuss those topics?
Yeah. So there are some similarities in that it is a good idea to talk about racism and how big of a problem it is. It is a good idea to talk about sexism and how big of a problem it is, to point it out. That is good, whether you're talking about race or you're talking about gender and gender stereotypes. Where it differs is with gender. In our culture, we are constantly hitting our kids over the head with the concept that gender matters a lot, because we have different pronouns for different genders. We have different aisles in the toy store for different genders. We have different clothes for different genders. We have different sports teams for different genders. We have different bathrooms for different genders. And kids notice this. And what it says to them is like, gosh, gender must be a really important category. And there must be differences between the genders, because why else would you make such a big deal about these categories as being separate unless there were these big, big differences between the genders? And that, combined with what they're seeing about the power hierarchy between the genders, that just amplifies this inference that, like, okay, boys and girls must be very different, and I guess girls just aren't as good and aren't as smart. So what that means when we're referring to gender in our world is we should kind of try to de-emphasize it. So, teachers, it's best if teachers do not like line up kids by, boy, girl, or say boys and girls, here's our lesson for today. The less that you can kind of like talk about each gender and call them out as separate, the better it is for kids. And this also means like, yeah, just if you see a group of boys, you just call them kids. Like, hey, do you see those kids over there? Rather than do you see those boys over there? And that, obviously they're going to be hearing everybody else in the world talking about gender a lot. But if we at home can, emphasize it a little bit less, then that can make a difference and help to sort of calm down that belief that boys and girls are really different. With race, it's kind of the opposite problem in that kids can see that skin color matters. They see these power hierarchies, and yet, especially if you are a white parent, you probably don't talk much about race. And so kids are like, wow, race matters. Skin color clearly matters in this world, but mom and dad aren't talking about it at all. And maybe if you bring it up, they also shush you and they're like, don't talk, if you're in a grocery store and your kid says like, she has really dark skin, your instinct might be to be like, that's not okay to say, shush, we don't talk about that. And that is sending also a strong message, which is, wow, okay, so race matters, they can see it, but mom and dad don't want to talk about it, which means it's like really important, but in a bad way. Like, it's something taboo, it's something bad. And that sends a very powerful message too. So with race, what we want to do is kind of normalize conversations about it. And if your kid brings up like, oh, my friend who has dark skin, or points out people have different skin colors, you just say, yeah, people have different skin colors. Isn't that cool? We're all different. And so instead of like not allowing our kids to talk about it and not talking about it ourselves, we want to just sort of make it like, yes, this exists in the world and clearly it matters, and then talk about racism, but not sort of send this message that like, this is a bad thing and we do not allow anybody to talk about it.
Oh, that's good. And I totally agree with that I think so many white parents unfortunately avoid it because they feel like if they're implying something negative if they have those conversations. So I think that's important information for everyone to understand. Now, the whole topic that we wanted to talk about tonight is, we're raising kids for the 21st century, right? Which is, like I said, very different from when I grew up in terms of what I was learning, what I was facing. So they're going to be working in a global economy. They're going to have to, obviously have more interaction with the people of diverse backgrounds, whether that's race, religion, ethnicity, where they're from in the world, what language they speak. We want them to be confident and resilient and adaptable. Basically, we want them not to be assholes. So I guess the question is, parents can have these conversations at home and they can reinforce these topics, but these kids are going to school every day, so what can we do to help support our schools? What should we be doing as parents to help kids develop these skills, not only at home, but when they are away from us, when they're talking to teachers and other students and out with their friends? What can we be doing and supporting to like not raise assholes?
Yeah. It's hard, right? It's really hard. I can highlight a few things that I could start with schools and what we can support at schools. And these are some really broad stroke things, but they've become controversial, unfortunately, and politicized. But we know, for instance, that social emotional learning programs like SEL is sometimes referred to, is really good for kids' schools to have. These are programs that basically are teaching kids about feelings, teaching them that it's okay to have all kinds of feelings. And what we know from the research, and we should do this at home too, let your kids have feelings, even if it's feelings we don't like to see, like let our kids be afraid and sad and angry, and validate those feelings and have conversations about feelings. The research is really powerful here, where just doing that really sets the stage for building compassion and empathy. So it helps to build a skill called theory of mind, which is essentially this ability for kids to take other people's perspectives. And theory of mind is like one of the most important foundations for compassion and empathy and generosity and helpfulness. So to the degree that, just like it's hard, because I think a lot of us were socialized to hide our feelings and to sort of, tell boys like, don't be afraid, don't be a wuss, whatever. It is much better if we just let them have the feelings, let them experience them. That helps them learn how to manage them. And that lets them understand what other people who have feelings, what does it look like when my friend is frustrated versus sad versus angry? It really helps them read other people's body language and feelings and then respond to them appropriately. So social emotional learning programs, also really great for reducing bullying, by the way, in schools. I think another thing that we sometimes don't do is we don't like to see our kids fail and screw up and make mistakes. And I know we've all like heard about snowplow parenting and helicopter parenting. And that's basically like when parents are kind of jumping in and rescuing kids and doing things for them and not really letting them experience challenges and failure. And we know that it's really crucial for kids to experience those things in order to build resilience. Like the more that our kids can, get through hard things and figure out that, wow, I can manage that. I can live through that. It was not the end of the world when I forgot my homework. It was not the end of the world, when I didn't do well on this test, whatever it is. And to not like kind of jump in when they have struggles with homework, that can really help to build resilience. And so it's really hard. In fact, I just had like an experience with my 12-year-old today where he did not do well on an assignment and he was so upset. And, I was like, I actually said to my friend, I actually think this is a really good opportunity. Like we had a conversation about, well, what can you do now? Should you talk to your teacher about why it didn't go well? Maybe we just didn't understand the assignment. Let's learn about, what we can do better next time. And like these kinds of situations where our kids are really upset can be really good learning experiences. So that's another big theme from my book. I realize these are really broad though.
No, I think it's actually really helpful because I think a lot of parents, I mean, you don't want your kids to fail. So, how as a parent do you keep your emotions in check? I think the reaction might be, I will help you. I'm going to go protect you. I'm going to make sure. And you don't want to show that you're disappointment or you're upset either. So it's a hard line as a parent to like, let them learn from their failures without jumping in or showing your own disappointment or your own emotions around that.
Yeah.
So I have been referencing the fact that I think my children who, have grown up, because they're all adults now, but have grown up in a very different age, social media, right? I mean, they have had access to the internet. They have had access to what all of their friends are doing every moment of the day from practically the time they were born. What is the research or what is the, exposure to social media and all of this constant ability to find information? How does that impact our kids? And any advice around like social media usage or what's, how to handle that with children?
Yeah. It's really complex. We need more research on this. I mean, there is a lot of research that's been done, but a lot of it's hard to interpret. I've seen a lot of people talking about how social media might be the, single reason that teenagers are, really depressed right now. I mean, there was a CDC report that came out a few months ago that found that like 42% of US high schoolers are experiencing persistent feelings of sadness and hopelessness. And these are really worrying statistics, but I caution against blaming it all on one thing, like blaming it all on social media, because there's a lot of things that have been changing in our world, social media being one of them. So, I do think it's a little more nuanced than some of the messages we're getting. But I do think also that we do need to help kids create healthy boundaries around tech use and around social media. So what the research overwhelmingly shows in terms of like the approach that works best with kids is to really like be a collaborator with your kids with tech, like more of a mentor rather than a limiter. So there's been some studies done showing that like parents who really like talk to their kids about what they're doing on their screens and play video games with them instead of just saying, you need to put down your iPad or you can't do this, but really trying to understand what they're doing and engage with them, that these kids get into less trouble online. And it's partially because I think these parents kind of know what their kids are up to a little more, right? Because they're like having these conversations. But it's also means that kids understand that they're, that the parents are receptive to conversations. If they're struggling with something, they know that like, well, mom's okay with, talking to me about apps and what I'm doing and all the, the things that I'm going through. And so it kind of just creates more opportunities for dialogue. And so, kids just do better. With social media, I do think what the research suggests is that the longer we can wait before letting kids use things like Instagram and Snapchat and TikTok, the better off they probably will be. Wait Until 8th is a really great organization where if you can get like parents in your community to agree, or at least like a decent number to agree to wait until 8th grade to let your kids have phones and to let your kids onto social media, it really helps to have other people that you could work with on this. But I will also say that if you're in a community where like every 7th grader has social media, and your kid is going to be the only one who doesn't, then that's also, something you have to weigh, because there are social risks to not having access to some of these if everybody else has it, right? So it's like there's not a single answer here. It really depends on your community and what your kid also is doing on social media. So we also know that, like, if kids are using social media to connect with friends in real life and to share things that are going on in their life, those social media uses are much more healthy than like the kid who is just passively scrolling and seeing all their friends doing things without them and feeling this FOMO. So it's complicated. It's not all bad, but to the degree that we can like really work with our kids and encourage them to use social media in healthy ways. And maybe, if we can, like, delaying access to the social media in particular for as long as possible, those are some things to try to keep in mind.
Yeah, I think it is important for parents to be involved and understand the community. I had a friend, I remember, and she would not let her child get on social media till at an age where all of his friends were already on there. And I was like, that child they're communicating with each other about their plans only on social media. So these, you're being left out. So I do think having the pulse of the community and what's going on is really important. But I'm going to say this as a parent, like, technology moves fast, and it is hard to keep up with the newest app and the latest and greatest thing the kids are doing, or the fake accounts they set up behind your back. Any advice for parents on like best ways to kind of keep up with this, whether it's conversations with your kids or other parents, or, just how do we manage that?
Yeah. I mean, I do think to the degree that we can like ask our kids, like at dinner, be like, hey, what were you up to on your iPad? Are there any new cool games that you're doing? Like, I would love to, check them out with you. I don't know. Some kids are going to be like, no, mom, I do not want to talk to you about this stuff. But some kids will be like, oh yeah, actually I'm doing this cool thing. And like, just trying to check in regularly, because as you say, it changes fast. And to the degree that we can just sort of like, check in a non-judgmental way, but in a like, I'm interested in your life, like this, it sounds like you're doing fun things. Tell me about them. Can I play this game with you? That really helps. I also completely agree that we should be talking to other parents. There is, for some reason, this like, I think it's like a shame and a fear that other parents are going to judge us because, maybe we let our kids do things online that we worry other parents are going to think like is not okay for us to be doing and we shouldn't be doing. And so we don't talk to other parents about what their kids are doing. And I really think like we can learn so much from each other, and we can help, also like with things like wait until 8th, like we can sort of gauge what's going on in the community and maybe make decisions as a community. Like, yes, I think maybe let's try to hold off on whatever it is, Snapchat for another year. We really benefit. So, if you're afraid that like other parents are going to judge you, chances are they're also afraid of this, and they would actually very much welcome you to approach them and talk to them about like, what are your kids doing? What have you heard about what they're up to? Like, what are they talking about? Do you know? Like, I think that can be really helpful.
You can commiserate with how you're out of touch all of you are as old parents. And, your kids start to think of you as old and out of touch. That happens
Totally.
quickly.
Totally.
So another big topic that we definitely are hearing about today in the news and in school is gender identity, sexual orientation. There's lots of policies right now that are being pushed to prohibit teaching or even like discussing this topic in schools. And we hear words like grooming and indoctrination. So curious what your response is to that, like in a science-based way, about kids being indoctrinated on topics. And what do parents need to understand about that?
Yeah. There is no evidence to suggest that talking to kids about gender identity or about sexuality makes them, more likely to question their assigned gender or to become gay. Like these conversations are not changing our kids. What they're doing is they are, normalizing maybe the differences that they are seeing around them, or maybe that they are feeling inside. And we're sending them the message that like, it's okay to be whoever you are. And it's okay for your friends to be whoever they are. And we will love you and we will accept you no matter what. And I mean, those are such powerful messages. Like the most important thing we can do for our kids' self-esteem is to communicate our unconditional love to them. And I think often assume that our kids know that we'll love them no matter what, but the research suggests that that's not always the case. And they really start to think, especially like if we put pressure on them to do certain things and stuff, they start to interpret, they start to think of it as like our love is contingent on like who they are, what they do, how much, what grades they get. So it is just crucial for us to like repeatedly kind of hit our kids over the head with the fact that like, we love you no matter what you do, no matter who you are, no matter anything, like we will always love you and always accept you. So I think, having these conversations is just so important, because it's letting our kids know that like, this is okay. This is okay with us. People are different, and that is beautiful, and it sort of helps too if like they have friends or peers in a situation where where they're not sure what's going on, they're trying to understand how to support their friends. Those kind of conversations can also help help you brainstorm. Like if your kid might be like, actually, yes, my friend now uses they them pronouns, and it's really interesting. Like then you can start a conversation about like, well, how can we best support that friend, and et cetera. So I definitely we are not indoctrinating our kids by talking to them about these things. We are not changing outcomes. We are just like making them feel more loved.
I like that you are helping your kid also support their friends, or because it's hard to be a kid and it's really hard to be a teenager. So I definitely think having that open line of communication and the things that you as a parent talk about with your child 100% is also helping them deal with friendships, and deal with other aspects of their life. So I think that is super important. I think this goes back to the point of like, so many parents are like, oh, if we just don't talk about that topic, then they'll never know it exists, or they won't know that there's, that gender identity is an issue, or that people could be gay, or that, someone's family has, two moms or two dads. And, the reality, I think what you've covered is that hiding that information, number one, they're going to know, they're going to see. And number two, then they don't have the means or the ability to have like, informed conversations, and they make assumptions. Am I saying that correctly? That they're making assumptions about the world. And if we don't set them straight with our values, they're just going to make assumptions or learn from their friends.
That's very true. Yeah. Yeah. And also, they might, if we don't talk to our kids about it, they don't maybe know what we think. They don't know what we believe. They don't know how we feel. And so if they are, struggling to know how to support a friend, or they see a friend who's being bullied, they might not come to us because they don't know that we'd necessarily be supportive. So I think we really have to be explicit in, sharing our values on these issues with our kids, so that, they know that we are there for them if they need help.
Now, in your book, you discuss learning from all the research and even recognizing mistakes that you've made in your own life, or things you've done with your own children. So what was like your biggest revelation in writing this book?
So, I struggled with whether to even write the book, because I think sometimes like when you're trying to help parents, it inadvertently sends the message that like, there's a wrong way to parent, and that and that like, if you mess up on specific things, like you're going to screw up your kids. And the last thing I wanted to do was like make parents feel ashamed for the choices they were making. So what I learned, and I feel like this is maybe the most important message from my book, is that it is actually sometimes really good to quote unquote make mistakes as parents. First of all, we all do it. I've talked to so many child psychologists who are like the experts. They have PhDs in how to deal with children, and they're, yelling at their kids sometimes, and they are not sure how to handle situations, and they are doing things that they consider like, oh, I screwed up. Right. So first of all, like nobody's perfect, even when you have a PhD in it. But our quote unquote, like the things that we consider to be mistakes as parents, I see them as opportunities now. And I really didn't before. So let's say like, you are having a rough day and you lose your temper at your kid and you yell at them, right? And we would consider maybe that like screwing up as a parent, right? So when we do something like that, we are potentially doing three things that are helpful for our kids. First of all, we are showing our kids that everybody makes mistakes. And this is incredibly powerful as well, because kids, we don't realize this, but sometimes kids think that like, as they get older, they should make fewer and fewer mistakes. And that as an adult, like you should never, ever make a mistake, right? They have this idea in their head, and we really want to rid them of that. And we want them to know that literally like every adult makes mistakes. It is just part of life. And we want to normalize that so that they, understand when they feel challenged and when they screw up, like it is not a judgment on their character. It is just life, right? The other thing is it gives us opportunities to model taking responsibility for what we've done and model a good apology. And so, every time I yell at my kids, first I take deep breaths and try to calm down. And then I say, I am so sorry that I just yelled at you. That was not okay. And I'm really sorry. What can I do to make you feel better? Like, what can I do to make it up for you? And sometimes too, like, then it gets into a conversation of like, what could I have done to help myself calm down? Like, what would be your, like, my kids love this. They love when I come to them with a problem and I'm like, what do you think I should have done instead of yelling at you? Like, what could I have done to calm down? And they're like, well, mom, you should definitely have taken 3 deep breaths. You could stomp on the floor instead of yelling. And they love that. But again, this is like reinforcing things for them to learn so that they have strategies in these same situations. So I really want to rid parents of this idea that like you have to be a perfect parent and that they're, making a mistake is like a bad thing, because it really, these are really just opportunities for us to, model accountability and for them to, to model the fact that like everybody is a work in progress, including us.
Well, thank you, Melinda, for all of that great information. We really appreciate it. Julie, I'm going to turn it over and see if you have some questions in the chat.
So the first question that was asked is, do you have resources or input on how screen time actually impacts brain chemistry? And the example that they gave was interferes with sleep time.
Right. I recently interviewed a researcher for my newsletter who talked a little bit about this. I don't think there's enough research on this at all. It was interesting though. What he said was, everybody talks about the blue light from screens keeping people up. And it is true that, if you are looking at screens with a lot of blue light right before bed, it does potentially affect your ability to sort of, calm down and go to sleep. But he said, really though, what affects, especially for tweens and teens, what affects their sleep more than the blue light from the device is what they're actually doing on the device. And is it riling them up in some way, emotionally or otherwise? So, it's not super clear exactly what's happening. But we do know that it can impact and does impact sleep. And another newsletter that I recommend on Substack is Techno Sapiens. And it's a researcher from Brown University, Jackie Nessie. She writes all about this and she covers the latest research with a lot of nuance on like basically the impact of screens and social media on kids. So I would recommend subscribing to her newsletter too.
Then the next question is, are there published resources or podcasts to hear what doctors are saying about gender affirming care? And I know that we have had a physician, or actually a couple of them on, but do you have any that, you recommend?
Yeah. So I've interviewed a few physicians who have like a lot, a pretty big social media presence. Jack Turbin is a trans, I think, psychiatrist who does a lot of work in this area and has an Instagram that where he shares a lot of research on gender affirming care. So that comes to mind right now. I did an interview too with a gender therapist for my newsletter just a couple of weeks ago too, and she shared some resources as well, and just some sort of like overall approaches to like how to how best to support your child if they're questioning their gender or those would be what I'd recommend for now.
Well,
sorry, I don't have more off the top of my head.
A companion question to that is, do you have the site for the study that discusses gender that does not lead to kids wanting to identify as another gender?
Well, sure. What I said was there's no evidence to suggest that's true. Like there's not so in research, you can't really prove a negative, right? You can't really have a study that proves that something doesn't affect something else. But what you can look at is, do we find that like correlationally that parents who have these conversations with kids are then, more likely to go on to do that. And I do not believe there's any evidence to suggest that at all. That doesn't mean that we couldn't use more research to try to, get more granular on that issue, but I have not seen a study that has ever suggested that to be the case.
So what do you do to build a child's empathy or ability to interact with peers whose parents have different political views than your family has?
That is hard. Yeah. So, I mean, one thing I talk to my kids about a lot is just like everybody has a very, has a different family situation, has had different experiences throughout their lives, that shape who they are. And we aren't privy to those. Like we don't know everything that a person's ever been through. When I've talked to, for instance, my kids about like, other kids in their grade who engage in bullying, I do like really also try to instill some empathy for that child and say, I wonder if that kid is struggling at home. Like, I wonder if, there's something really hard going on in their life. And I'm not trying to excuse the behavior in any way, but I do think that it can be helpful to prompt kids to sort of take a step back and think about other people's, like, and the fact that they can have different perspectives and different emotional experiences than they have. That is just broadly very, very helpful for building empathy in general, for building like compassion and promoting generous behavior. So in those situations, yeah, I would probably say something like, I don't agree with what their parents say. And you can explain why if you'd like, to your child. But I don't know why they feel that way. And there could be a lot of reasons for it that I don't, that we just don't understand. And just sort of, plant that in their head that like, we can't know their whole story. I think that can be helpful.
So someone said, I'm wondering if you've looked at the issue of talking about disability. Their daughter has a very visible disability and uses a wheelchair, but they've watched parents encourage their kids not to look at her daughter, or as parents were embarrassed that their kid asked why her daughter didn't walk. She felt that this taught kids to think disability was bad and something to be ashamed of. You describe the importance of normalizing racial difference. I wonder if there is a good research about normalizing kids for disability.
Research wise, I'm not sure how much there is, but there are resources out there. There's a book called A Kid's Book About Disabilities that I really recommend. So I did interview the author of that book for my newsletter, and also another psychotherapist about, how do we basically like normalize disability, and how do we talk to kids about it, right? Because yes, I think that our instincts on this are often well-meaning, but really counterproductive, where yes, we will tell kids they can't look at somebody, or that they can't ask questions about, their disability. And that is just, again, really promoting this like fear and this taboo feeling of like, this is a bad thing and I'm not allowed to pay attention to it. And that's just, it's like the opposite of what we want to be doing. Right. So I just looked up, I'm going to just share a link to what I wrote about it, in terms of, what what this author had suggested, but like, among other things, like there's a difference between like a kid noticing a difference in sort of like a neutral way, or, and then commenting on a difference in a negative way. And so like, if a kid says like, that person's in a wheelchair, that's fine, right? Yes, that person is in a wheelchair, and you can kind of like build on that and say, yeah, isn't it cool that people have different ways of getting around? Like, wouldn't it be boring if we were all the same? I think they had that in my newsletter. But if somebody says like, why is that kid like weirdly flapping his arms or saying something negative, you could kind of gently correct and say like, that to me, that doesn't look weird. It looks like he moves his body in a way that, he wants to move his body. And that's pretty cool. He looks pretty happy. So, I think really just like trying to normalize again, and trying to communicate to kids that differences are not bad, and it's okay to be curious, and it's okay to ask questions.
Another person wrote, just last night, their almost 11-year-old woke up following a nightmare about a mass shooting and was terrified that he may encounter something like that at home or in school. I'm worried that he has been overexposed to news about gun violence. What can or should we do to help him? I feel like a liar telling him that he is safe, although he was in that moment. That for me is very tough.
Yeah, it is. And I have written some about this exact question, and I was just on a Slate podcast talking about this too. It is, well, I will also admit that my kid's school had a lockdown a couple weeks ago and my daughter was out at recess at the time, my 8-year-old, and basically the school heard what they thought were gunshots right next to the school. And all the kids rushed inside, and kids were screaming and crying, saying like, are we going to die? Are we going to die? And it turned out that people who lived right next to the school had set off firecrackers. But it took a while for them to understand what was going on. And they went into lockdown, and the kids had no idea what was happening. And it was terrifying. And my daughter, this was maybe 5 weeks ago now, and she is still having nightmares because she thinks she was like, in the moment, I thought somebody was coming after us with guns. So it is really a hard time to be raising children. But what I think is really important to keep in mind, and I did write about this and I can share it. There are some statistics that, look, no child should be at risk of being shot at school. And our country is just such a tragedy and travesty that that our kids are not safe in school. But if you look at the numbers, it is exceptionally rare to be shot at school. It is, I think kids are like 100 to 1,000 times more likely to die in a car crash this year than they are to get shot at school. So I think one thing that you can keep in mind is that even though it is so salient and it is so terrifying, it is still exceptionally rare for, the chance that your child is going to get shot at school or experience something like this is exceedingly small. And I think that we do need to keep that in mind, and we do need to communicate to our kids that, it is rare, and to point out the things that keep them safe. So yeah, I think, it's a matter of like validating. If they're terrified, don't take that away from them and say you shouldn't be scared, but say, I understand why you're scared. This is really scary. And I say this to my daughter, like, of course you were terrified during that lockdown. Like that must have been so terrifying. But then to also follow that up with but you are safe, and here's why you are safe. So even if we don't believe it in some ways, I think we do have to reassure our kids that they are safe. This is what they need more than anything else. And if they feel unsafe, then that is, that's really going to affect them. So, yeah, I can also share a link to that newsletter if that's helpful. It's really hard. It's really hard.
It is. I've done gun violence prevention for over 20 years. And so I also think that that we need to balance that too, though, with some safety information as well. Because I know now that we have had several people who were at one place and survived, and at another that didn't, that were in multiple events. So, I think that we need to give them that as well. Let's see what else we have. Anything else? Any suggestions? Maybe, let's see, we're getting close on time, on how to best promote understanding and acceptance of LGBTQ among religious communities who see that as against their religious views and God's will. They gave an example of the Islamic community.
Oh gosh, that is a really good question. And I don't know that I am equipped to answer that. And one thing I will say, like, as a journalist, I'm always very I really try to rely on like the research and what experts have told me. And I've honestly never had that conversation with somebody who has, really thought about that a lot and looked at the research. So I don't want to like say anything that might not be supported. That's a really, really good question. I don't know if anybody has suggestions in the chat, but yeah.
It goes back to just sharing your values and why you believe what you believe. And
Right.
I think the thing I've learned from tonight is just, you never really want to ignore your kids' questions or, assume that they, if you don't answer that they're better off. They need answers when they're answering those questions, but sometimes it might just be sharing why you believe what you believe and supporting that. So
yes, absolutely. That's a great suggestion.
Julie, is there other?
No, actually, I just have one. That's my own. What do you think about changing the language of normal, the normalizing? Because really, there's not really such a thing.
Yeah, good point.
And especially for a lot of the things that we consider to be normal are rooted in other things and maybe are not culturally relevant for another culture or for someone who's different from you. Yeah. So what are your thoughts on that? Or have you ever really thought about that and maybe looked into, because I really tried when my kids are also adults and my kids are all in their 30s, but I really tried to explain that, normal is a construct, just like a lot of other things. And so, what someone might consider normal is not normal to someone else. And that doesn't mean that it's wrong or bad or any of those things. So, just kind of, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful framing. I agree. I do not like the word. And I also agree that I have used it a lot in this conversation. I think it's one thing that's very tricky, is that normal is also a scientific word. Like we talk about normal
Yes.
distribution, right? And so scientists often use the word normalize and, talk about normal in a scientific sense. So I hear it a lot, and it is in my brain, and I use it, but I completely agree that it's not the right word. And I think it's emphasizing kind of the wrong thing, right? We want to be emphasizing that, like, that differences are beautiful and are okay. And when we are instead, framing things in terms of what is maybe the most common or something like that, then we're kind of emphasizing the opposite of what we want to be doing, right? It's hard sometimes to change language, and it takes some time, but yeah, I completely agree with you. It is not a great word.
Well, I hope that you all have walked away with some good information, especially for those of you who do have young children out there that you're trying to raise in this very complex world. I know Julia had dropped in the chat earlier, so please go check out Melinda's page and sign up for her newsletter. It is, I promise you, very informative. So please check that out. And thank you guys so much for coming tonight and sharing your questions in the chat. And thank you to Melinda for sharing your wisdom with us. We appreciate that. And hopefully we'll see you guys on Thursday night for the Dobbs event. And in the meantime, I hope everybody has a really great rest of their evening.
Thank
Good night,
you.
everybody.
This was so fun.